Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, we have begun a series last week looking at this question of moral values and where do moral values come from, and does the existence of moral values, in particular objective moral values, point to the handiwork of a creator? And what we're going to do this week, we are going to look at this question from the naturalistic perspective. So the question of a Darwinian perspective. From a naturalistic perspective, we would expect to find moral values would have to come from one of two places. Either it is a group consensus, which we're going to talk about next week, or it's the result of evolution, or I suppose some combination of each. And we can work through that as we go forward. Again, we're going to go back to our old friend Richard Dawkins. We may go back to Charles Darwin this week. We're going to see where this goes. But looking at this question, this is how Richard Dawkins addresses this issue in the God Delusion. He says, I am suggesting that the same is true of the urge to kindness, to altruism, to generosity, to empathy, and to pity. In ancestral times, we had the opportunity to be altruistic only towards close kin and potentially reciprocators. Now, let's pause for just a minute on that. So what he's saying is, in the earliest times, what we would consider today to be moral values, acts of kindness, altruism, what he's saying there, we would have only expected that to be shown to members of our closest kin, and that would be, I suppose, leaning into the herd mentality idea of Darwinian evolution, or to people who would reciprocate to us. So ultimately, I'm being nice to you, but really there isn't much altruism going on there because I expect to get something back in return. So I'm going to be nice to you, but it's with the hope that the next time I see you, I'm going to get something back and maybe something even better. Because otherwise, why expend the energy? So that's going to be the two ideas. And then he continues, and unfortunately, these are the things that are hard to hear. And again, credit Richard Dawkins for saying it and being true to it, because from a naturalistic perspective, as an atheist, he has to hold to these things, and to his credit, he does. He says, nowadays, so that was originally, he says, in ancestral times, we had the opportunity to be altruistic only towards close kin and potentially reciprocators. Nowadays, that restriction is no longer there, but the rule of thumb persists, so it's carried forward. Would it not? Why would it not? It's just like sexual desire. We can no more help ourselves feeling pity when we see a weeping unfortunate who is unrelated and unable to reciprocate than we can help ourselves feeling lust for a member of the opposite sex who may be infertile or otherwise unable to reproduce. Both are misfirings, Darwinian mistakes, blessed, precious mistakes. Wow. It's just one of those things that you don't like hearing someone say because you look at that and go, that is not who we are. But again, credit Richard Dawkins for sticking with it. And the reason he brings the example of sex into this question is the idea being, from a Darwinian perspective, sex is all about reproducing and expanding the species. So extending the life of the species, producing the next generation, that's the Darwinian desire. And so what he's saying is a Darwinian desire to have sex with someone who is unable to reproduce children, well, that's a Darwinian mistake because that's the only purpose of sex. Wrong about that, but I understand the point that he's making, as horrible as from a morality perspective as it can be, but I understand the point that he's making. He also then points to the same thing. Just like that, being nice to someone who is in no means, who's not part of our family or not able to reciprocate is the same Darwinian mistake. That is a really interesting way to put that. And I don't think it's one that any of us are really okay with. Again, like I said, to his credit, he sticks with it. But the problem that we have is that bad taste that leaves in your mouth. The problem that we have is you going, I don't like anything that he just said. If evolution was true, not only would we be okay with that, we would look at it and go, yeah, what we really need to do is to get rid of that feeling of being nice for no good reason. If evolution was really true, from natural selection should have gotten rid of that. Now, granted, he calls it a blessed, precious mistake that it has persisted. And the reason he says that is, of course, because natural selection should leave no place for that whatsoever. And yet it not only persists, we can't look at each other and in all honesty go, yeah, that person at work or that friend of the family, they lost a loved one. I sent them a card or I gave them a hug or something. We made them dinner. There was a family that we knew, they lost a loved one. We brought them dinner and, we had them over to the house or we did something nice for them. That was a mistake. A blessed, precious mistake. None of us believe that and none of us are okay with that. I understand from an evolutionary perspective why that has to be the conclusion that you reach, but nobody is okay with that. And the fact that nobody's okay with that's built into us that, no, oh my goodness, why would you not be nice to someone who's just suffered tragedy in their life? That's built into us. And that built-in feeling that I should do something is proof that evolution is untrue. It's not a blessed, precious mistake. It's what separates us from the other species. It's what makes us different than the primates. We've been talking about this idea in the weeks preceding about human consciousness. Okay, we've been talking about that idea about human consciousness. And while from a DNA perspective, there's not that much difference between us and a chimpanzee, when you look at the difference between us and the chimpanzee, from a consciousness perspective, from this perspective, a morality perspective, night and day difference. This is why. It's built into us that we're not okay with that. And this is the proof of what's going on. I want to again quote from C.S. Lewis, from Mere Christianity. And again, like I reminded you last time, Lewis was an atheist originally early in his life and came to Christianity late in life. But Lewis addresses this question of, can we point to moral values being related to a Darwinian process? And I love the way he tears that apart. He says, but feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help whether you want to or not. Supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you will probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct, okay? The other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the instinct for self-preservation. Okay, so Lewis is trying to address this from a Darwinian perspective. And he goes, okay, you hear someone call for help and you feel two urges. Your herd instinct says, I need to protect members of my herd, so I should help. But your instinct for self-preservation says, I should protect myself, I should not. Now, he's addressing this from a Darwinian perspective. Those are going to be the two primary factors that should be at work inside of us, but they're not. And that's what Lewis goes on to address. He says, you will probably feel two desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct. The other, a desire to keep out of danger due to the instinct for self-preservation. But you will find inside you, in addition to these two impulses, a third thing, which tells you you ought to follow the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now, this thing that judges between the two instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot be either of them. Lewis is exactly right, and we each know that and recognize that. Whether it's something as serious as, oh my goodness, there's somebody who desperately needs help, or whether it's even just as simple as, oh, that guy's broken down on the side of the road, it would be nice to help, although it will be an annoyance to me. The question, it's even if it's just a question of it will be an annoyance to me versus it will be a danger to me. The impulse inside of us, the natural impulse inside of us, is to do the thing that we would be least likely to do from an evolutionary perspective. And there is that third thing inside of us that none of us can deny. Now, you can ignore it. You can suppress it. You can ignore it for long enough. You can almost make it go away. As a Christian, we refer to it as that still small voice of that relationship between us and God, of God speaking to us through our hearts. We can ignore it and suppress it, but it's there. And that's what Lewis is talking about when he does this. Lewis continues, and I think this is good. Another way of seeing that the moral law is not simply one of our instincts is this. If two instincts are in conflict, and there's nothing in a creature's mind except those two instincts, obviously the stronger of the two must win. But at those moments when we are most conscious of the moral law, it usually seems to be telling us to side with the weaker of the two impulses. You probably want to be safe more than you want to help the man who is drowning. But the moral law tells you to help him all the same. And surely it often tells us to try to make the right impulse stronger than it naturally is. I mean, we often feel it our duty to stimulate the herd instinct by waking up our imaginations and arousing our pity and so on, so as to get up enough steam to do the right thing. But clearly we are not acting from instinct when we are about to make an instinct stronger than it is. The thing that says to you, your herd instinct is asleep, wake it up, cannot itself be the herd instinct. He's right. I love the way he drives that point home. It is not enough when you look at that question of you have a man in danger. One instinct is to be safe. I shouldn't enter that situation. I could also be in danger. Versus the other, which is I should help. The I should help is going to be the weaker instinct, unless in the rare instance that the person who needs help is a close family member of yours. The stronger instinct should and is always going to be, I should not do that. It will endanger me. And yet what do we see? We are drawn to the weaker of the two instincts. I should help. That doesn't make any sense. If the only thing inside of us are those two instincts, it just doesn't make any sense to help. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at a quotation from Charles Darwin. And most of us today do not, well, let's be honest, most of us today have never read The Origin of Species. But almost no one today ever goes back and reads the other things that Charles Darwin wrote. And many of his ideas, particularly around the ideas, well, his ideas naturally head in a direction that became the eugenics movement coming out of the late 1800s into the 1900s. The idea of natural selection, this idea of Darwinian evolution when applied to people, is not something that any of us like to look at. And I want to quote from this to make the point, and it is a repugnant quote, but this is who Charles Darwin was. These were his quotations. And even Darwin, when he says this, backs off of it, and he can't help but back off of it, and he tries to back out of it, but then again, he can't quite back out of it because he recognizes the impulse of what he's doing. I'm going to read the second part of the quote because the first part of the quote is just so repugnant, I don't even want to put it out there. But in looking at this, Darwin is approaching this idea of Darwinian evolution applied to the human species going forward and the survival of the fittest as it relates to the breeding of better human beings. It's eugenics. It's like I said, it's repugnant and horrible. And the reason I want to make this point is this is not who we are. 2,000 years later, after the birth of Christ, after the sacrifice he made, and the radical teachings that he taught, the world has been forever changed and has turned in a direction that flies in the face of Darwinian evolution. The Christians refer to it as that still small voice. That idea that is built into our hearts that judges between those instincts. It's always been there throughout mankind. It was Jesus who reminded us of what it was. Through his teaching and through his actions on the cross, reminded us of what that was and brought us back to our Creator. Because what you're going to hear from Darwin does not line up with who we are, but it is the natural outcome of the ideas that Darwin taught. So let's just go through this briefly. The aid that we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of the social instincts, but subsequently rendered, in the manner previously indicated, more tender and more widely diffused. Nor could we check our sympathy, even at the urging of hard reason, without deterioration of the noblest part of our nature. We'll talk about nobility here in a second. The surgeon may harden himself whilst performing an operation, for he knows that he is acting for the good of the patient. But if we were intentionally to neglect the weak and helpless, it could only be for a contingent benefit with an overwhelmingly present evil. We must therefore bear the undoubtedly bad effect bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. It's painful to even say it. We must therefore bear the undoubtedly bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. Well, let's let that sink in. But there appears to be at least one check in steady action, namely that the weaker and inferior members of society do not marry so freely as the sound, and this check might be indefinitely increased by the weak in body or mind refraining from marriage, though this is more to be hoped for than expected. Charles Darwin. That is the less repugnant of the two quotes. And what he is saying there, what he is suggesting is going down this path of eugenics, where what we want to breed are better human beings. That is just, again, it makes your skin crawl when you hear someone say that. It absolutely is horrific, and it's not who we are. But you have to address the question, why isn't it who we are? Because from a strictly evolutionary perspective, that's what he's saying. From a strictly evolutionary perspective, as much as I didn't like Richard Dawkins' quote earlier, talking about this idea of, well, it's a mistake to feel sympathy for someone, that is exactly what Darwin is talking about. And Darwin is saying it's a mistake. Now, Darwin appeals to our nobility. Nobility has no place in a Darwinian model. It just simply doesn't. Dawkins referred to it as a blessed, precious mistake. And I understand that. That's the only thing you can come to from a Darwinian perspective. Darwin himself, again, talks about what a mistake it is. The undoubtedly bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. Wow. But the reason that you're not okay with that, and the reason that I'm not okay with that, cannot come from Darwinian evolutionary processes. Natural selection cannot explain why all of us look at that and go, oh my goodness, no. How could someone say that? That comes from objective moral values. And that's why when Darwin says something like that, it is so repugnant to us. That's why we cringe a little bit when we hear, hopefully a lot, when we hear something like that. That's why we should cringe when we hear something like that. But that thing that makes you cringe, this is what C.S. Lewis was talking about, that third thing, cannot be related to an evolutionary process, because natural selection would argue, I mean, this is the hard part. Natural selection, that's what Darwin's talking about. He is the one who floated the theory. This book was written, 16 years after The Origin of Species. No, 6 years. Sorry, I can't do basic math. This book was written not long after Origin of Species. It's one of his subsequent books. But that is just a repugnant idea. We should none of us be okay with that. Now, it has to go beyond, well, we're not okay with that. Why? You need to fill in the blank, the why part. And it's not just enough to say, well, just because it's not. Over and over again, we get to that point of going, well, that's wrong. Why is that wrong? Well, it just is. Okay, there's more there, and we need to recognize the more there. So the question that we're looking at this week, can we look at moral values and say that there's a good evolutionary explanation for how moral values have arrived? The answer is absolutely no, because moral values fly in the face of Darwinian evolutionary processes. Richard Dawkins recognizes it and says, well, it's a misfiring, a blessed, what does he say? A precious, blessed misfiring. Blessed, precious mistake. Okay, it's beyond that. It goes beyond being an evolutionary mistake. And that is the point, because deep down inside each one of us, we all know that and recognize it. Next week, we're going to continue looking at this. Next week, we're going to address the idea, well, maybe it's a consensus. Maybe it's a consensus of how we get there. And I think what we're going to find is consensus is a bad idea when it comes to these things. Thank you so much for joining us this week. If you enjoyed this week's episode, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. It makes a difference to the podcast, and I hope that you will. You can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. You can find more helpful information on our website at prooftograce.com. And you can email us with questions at proofttograce@yahoo.com.